law. What makes Islam Islam today in terms of how it's practiced is Islamic law. And I'm sure most of our listeners and viewers have heard of Shari'a law.
Yeah.
Shari'a in Arabic means like path. And so Islamic law basically is this idea that we are going to be able to, there's no separation of religion versus state, that it is existing together. And if you think about the history of Islam, that makes sense. From the very beginning, Islam has always been associated with political power, whereas Christianity, for example, was not for the first 300 years.
Right.
And so what happened was that Islam was not just a religion. They had to figure out how to govern. And how to govern on Quranic principles. And so what happened was there was these four main schools of jurisprudence that arose in the Islamic world around the same time. We're talking about the 9th, 10th century. And these schools of jurisprudence had slightly different interpretations on how to enact Islamic law. And these four schools exist to this day. So in fact, if you're in Egypt and you want to get married, you can choose under which of the four schools you want to get married because they have slightly different marriage laws. And some of them are more strict than others. For example, the Hanbali school is very strict. And so if you want to get, what some people will do is they'll get married under one school, and then if they want to get divorced, they'll go get a divorce certificate from another school because the judge from that will give you the divorce certificate, but the original won't.
Oh my goodness.
That's funny.
And so these four schools of Islamic jurisprudence that were founded in the 10th century were based on interpreting the Quran in a medieval context. And so that's where you get kind of these, when people hear about Sharia law, like you chop off someone's hand for stealing or you stone women for adultery, that's where these laws are coming from, these like law schools that were started in the 10th century. What happened, though, is soon after, what people started saying was, okay, we can't keep reinterpreting the Quran. So they raised the bar for interpreting the Quran. So they said, in order to now give a new interpretation or a new law from the Quran, you need to be able to speak Arabic fluently. You have to memorize the entire Quran, memorize the entire Hadith, which is the sayings of Muhammad, which is, we're talking tens of thousands of, and you have to be perfect in all of the other areas of the Islamic sciences. So no one could meet that standard anymore. So there's a phrase in Arabic, which is, the word is ijtihad, which is maybe a bit of a deep cut here, but I promise it'll make sense, which is ijtihad comes from the same word as jihad. And jihad means struggle, and ijtihad is the idea of interpreting through struggling kind of idea. And at the point of the medieval period, after these four schools were founded, they kind of closed the gate of interpretation. They closed the gate of ijtihad and said, we're not going to have any new interpretations of the Quran and to apply to everyday life. And so this is why people look at Islam today and say it looks really barbaric and it looks really medieval. Why is that? It's because since the 10th century, they haven't been allowed to reinterpret the Quran into a modern context. They're forced to use the interpretations that were come up with in the 9th and 10th centuries. And so this is where you have kind of, when people look around the world and the troubles in the Middle East and all this kind of stuff, a lot of that is stemming from this particular issue where Muslims are not free today to give, hey, I'm going to read the Quran as a Muslim and I'm going to come up with a new system of governance based on Quranic principles. They're not allowed to do that.
Wow. I see.
So this is why they're having to work through these medieval law systems to have Islamic law. And this is where this tension's coming from. Modern day Muslims throughout the Middle East are looking at this and saying, we don't want to live under these rules. We don't want to live under these medieval barbaric rules. But the institutions that control a lot of Islamic countries are still wanting to preserve their power, obviously. And so they maintain that. So this tension between, we want to, a lot of Muslims want, when I was in Egypt, one of my professors, she lived in England. And then she had a fatwa declared against her in England. Basically, an Islamic cleric in England called for her death. So she had to leave England and move back to Egypt, where she was safer in Egypt. And she was someone, for example, who's she wants reform. So she says stuff like, women don't need to wear hijabs. That's a medieval thing. Why are you wearing a head covering? That's a medieval thing. Why are we having these certain laws? But she's a Muslim. She's like, I'm a strict Muslim. I believe the Quran. I believe Muhammad, but I just want to interpret it for the modern day. And that message is the kind of the fundamental boiling point and hot, like controversial point in the Islamic world right now is, what do we do about this? Do we reform and basically say to these 4 schools, okay, you know what, you guys are outdated, we're going to come up with a new interpretation? If they do that, the entire power structure is going to dissolve, basically, and it's going to start from zero, kind of like the Reformation, basically. Is they're at a similar point to where the church was before the Reformation. It's like, are we going to keep going down this path and just double down on what we've been doing, or are we going to totally change everything and see what happens? And this is one of the biggest, most interesting questions to see in the Islamic world moving forward, is what are Muslims going to do about this?
Wow. That's really fascinating. I wonder what would happen in the Islamic world if they decided, hey, we're going to just modernize it.
It's a great question. And this is what you see in a lot of these political, like the Arab Spring revolutions, stuff like that, is a lot of young people are saying, let's try this.
Yeah.
But it's easy to say, hard to do.
Of course.
And I got to say, like, in terms of a gospel perspective, I think the truth is, so right now, what's happening in the Middle East is, so my wife and I were in North Africa this last year, and we were doing interviews with believers in North Africa about, how did you become a Christian? How did that happen? Tell us about your story. And one of the fascinating things that we noticed is that, like, the Middle East, especially if we take the younger generation, so under 30 years old, is much more secular than they would like you to believe. It's kind of a similar thing that's happening in the West, where people are kind of de-Christianizing. In the West, I think we assume that other countries are impervious to the effects of secularism, but that's just not true. And so especially in the Middle East, where they don't have political stability, and so young people are like, excuse me, why can't we have what the West has? Why can't we have? And so unfortunately, they falsely attribute the West's success to secularism. So then they become atheists. But there's a big opening for the gospel right now in the Middle East, because people are hungry for something that isn't Islam, that isn't associated with this, like, kind of culture and religion and politics all tied into one. So the gospel message, where Jesus comes and says, hey, my kingdom is not of this world. And he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is completely, it supersedes all the kingdoms of earth, and you can be a citizen of heaven without having to, like, rebel against your country. That is actually a very appealing message to a lot of young people in the Middle East, because it's so different from what they've been told.